Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad you guys could attend today. I want to thank you and welcome everybody to the infrastructure session for opportunities in Brazil, put on by a joint effort between KPMG Canada and KPMG Brazil. I'm excited for our session today. We have a number of great speakers from around the globe, and we'll get right into it. So maybe we can move to the next slide just to get the introduction going. All right, so the speakers today, sorry, I had competing, the life of COVID here is I have competing conference calls going on in my house at the second with my wife, so apologies for that. So on our panel today, I think as everyone knows, we have Stephen Beattie, who's our Global Head of Infrastructure with KPMG based here in Canada, as where I am as well. I forgot to introduce myself, but that's next on the agenda. I'm Daniel Rasica. I'm a partner in our KPMG Canada practice. I spent 5 years in Brazil, but really have focused my practice around Brazil for the last 15 years. And I am the co-chair of the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, who has helped us put together the event as well today as a partner. We have Fernando Faria, who I worked with when I was in Brazil. He's the head of infrastructure in Latin America, infrastructure in Latin America. We also have Eduardo Hedges, who is a partner and the head of, Eduardo, head of infrastructure in Latin America as well, KPMG in Brazil. We have Marcos Quadros, who's a partner in infrastructure and the tax lead in Latin America. He'll bring you some tax aspects, which I know everybody always looks forward to hearing about. And lastly, we have Camila Bacelar, who's the Director International Tax Deal Advisory with KPMG in Brazil. With that, maybe we can move to the next slide. A few administrative points as we start out here. Just if anybody wants to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box on the right-hand side, and it'll come through, and we'll get to that question. We will track them, and I believe on our agenda, the idea is to answer some questions at the end. So if you want to save those for the end, we'll address them at the final. And if there's any technical issues, here's some help with you. You can use the help button at the top of the WebEx screen. If it doesn't resolve your issue, you can issue or enter a question via the question box, and someone will get back to you with that. Hopefully there are no issues. Everyone's presumably pretty accustomed to doing webinars at the moment, so that's great news. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Stephen. Stephen, maybe you can give us a little introduction as well. Oh, sorry, agenda. Let me do the agenda very quickly. So we're going to do this introduction, Stephen. I'll pass it to you in a second here.
Okay.
I gave it to you, but then I took it back right away. Sorry about that. We have a sector overview. We'll get into some opportunities on water. I know there was some recent transactions involving Canadian companies that maybe, Stephen, you'll talk about in a second. Some road opportunities, and then, of course, the tax insights. So back to you, Stephen, for real this time.
Super. Thanks, Dan. I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope this is as useful for you as it is for me. I think there are some huge opportunities in Brazil, and I want to talk specifically about water and roads. The changes in public policy relating to water are nothing short of momentous. Interestingly, we're advising the government of India on a very similar program to bring clean drinking water, in that case, to 150 million people who today don't get it. I think for those of you who are familiar with Brazil, you already know the scale of the opportunities that are there. But for those that aren't, have a good listen, because my sense is that the opportunities in Brazil will surprise you. And with that,
I think we lost.
Stephen. Yeah, unfortunately. So I think maybe Eduardo, we can pass over to you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Steve. Let's talk a little bit talking about the snapshot on the macroeconomic in Brazil. So, if we move to the next slide, this is just a glimpse on what is coming to Brazil in terms of the pandemic. Just a few remarks. I think it's impossible for investors to understand that currently the government, in order to face the pandemic, it has made some emergency aids and some other initiatives in order to perform like an emergency measures to the economy. And of course, it has been under volatile terms with what you can see in some macroeconomic indexes. But in the end, what we see when we are finalizing this year is that even though we're going to have a loss of the GDP, like all the countries that are affected by pandemics, the forecast is that we can see for the next year and the years to come are quite good. Okay, the numbers of inflation, I think that gives us the best message on what we understand in terms of the reaction of the Brazilian economy to the pandemic is that if you recall, Brazil in the last 25 years has been working on an inflation target regime, and the numbers that we can see that are going to end in December, it means that Brazil is going to still maintain the target inflation that was supposed to be in the zero. Okay, we're going to be in the center of the goal that was set for inflation for the CPI index. And so just a final remark on the macroeconomics, it seems that the issues that Brazil has pointed to the economy has providing some good numbers in terms of the reaction of the economy, and we forecast the best next year and the years to come. Okay. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure, as you can see, and the problem. Even though with the pandemics that they have increased some of the issues on infrastructure, but I think it's important to understand the size of the opportunity that we have here. If you take official numbers from the government and from the Brazilian Central Bank, Brazil has been investing around 18% in the last 10 years as a percentage of GDP in infrastructure. Okay. And for us to how can I say to fulfill to bridge this gap, Brazil needs to invest around 25% of this GDP. Okay, so it's the current situation that we have here. The problem is that when we see this gap that we need to bridge, historically Brazil, the participation between the public and the private sector is around 70% on the private sector and 30% on the public sector. So by doing so, it's quite easy to understand how dependent for foreign investments the Brazilian economy is in terms to attract these investors for the infrastructure sector. Okay, in terms of quantitative numbers, we have been talking about between $100 billion per year to $200 billion per year until the next 20 years, in order just to be comparable to the developed countries. Okay, and on the next slide, sorry, on the next slide, we made a division between the sectors which are that will be affected. I think that's important is that by understanding this, the Ministry of Infrastructure in Brazil has created in the last years a program that is set to not only to attract investors, but also to put opportunities in the market and to perform this liaison between the private sector and the government sector more easy. Okay. In this presentation, we're going to find that we're going to talk about the water and the transport, which are how I would say that the sectors that gives the most, the biggest returns for shareholders, as you can see. Okay, we're going to see in the presentation of my colleague Fernando the roads. We're talking about big returns and the amount of opportunities on the water and sanitation sector. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Then we're going to start talking about water. Okay, the next slide, please. Just for you to understand the current status quo of sanitation in Brazil, I also perform a remark for the ones that had gray hair. If you recall the times when Brazil performed the privatization of the energy sector, it seems to be, how can I say, a comparable situation that we're facing now in terms of opportunities on the sanitation side. Okay, what you're going to see is that the current situation as status quo is that we have around 40 million people without the access to treated water in Brazil. Just for you to understand, we have a population around 200 million people. The population of Canada, I believe, is around 40 million people. So we have an entire Canada here of Brazilians that do not have access to treated water, okay? And almost 100 million Brazilians without sewage water collection. And the important number here is the amount of losses that we currently face in terms of fiscal losses in water distribution, around 38%, okay? Which can represent a great gain and a great leverage for an investment, okay? What you're seeing right now is that Brazil, they have, of course, there's a law that has been partially approved. There are some articles that has been under discussion, but what we see in the market here is that this new law puts some new issues in the market in order to attract those investors. There's going to be a national agency of water that's going to be created. It's going to put regulations in the market for the private companies, okay? In terms of the privatization, for example, the municipalities don't need to approve a privatization of municipality concessions, okay? It's open to the market. They can participate from the big private companies, okay? And, which is the most important ones that they perform the universalization of services. That means that around until 2033, we will need 99% of people with access to cover to water, and around 90% of the people will need to have access to sewage, okay, to treated sewage, okay. So what we're talking here is about an investment that will go around 700 billion reais in terms of, you can go to the next slide, okay, around 700 billion reais of investments on sewage, okay. You can divide by 5 in order to take the numbers in US dollars, okay. And one thing that's important that we're talking about the returns, we talk about the opportunities in terms of the municipalities, in terms of the governments, in terms of the population that needs to be attended, but an important issue that needs to be addressed and needs to be understood by the investors that the credit market has moved as well to follow these opportunities. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. The data that has been provided in order to leverage the gains for the equity shareholder, which is kind of different that we saw in other infrastructure sectors and in the past, is that we're talking about, when we talk about sewage, we talk about long-term investments, okay? And now if you see the public banks and the National Development Bank, they are performing a credit that with terms that goes to 24 to 34 years, which is kind of huge, okay? And if you recall the first slide about the macroeconomic, we have an all-time low interest rate in the market. So we have a low credit, how can I say, an interest rate in the market in order to perform the coupon of the credit of the debt that's going to be provided, as well as we have long-term terms for those finance for investors. Okay, so which means that just a final summary of what you're saying here. You can go to the next slide. You have an amount of 700 billion of investments that need to be done, and you have credit to be provided to the market. The market is open for foreign investments. There has been new policies that will perform all the necessary measures for the safety of those investors, for the foreign investors. So I would say that, of course, my colleague Fernando talked a little bit about transport, but I would say that this is one of the most important sectors that we have right now in Brazil. Okay, I will pass forward. Thank you very much. Fernando, please.
Thank you, Eduardo, and hi everyone. Great to be here with you to speak about another sector where we actually see huge opportunities for private sector investment, which is the road sector. And why do we see a huge opportunity there also. Basically, to start on that, I think it's important to recognize that today on the Brazilian cargo transportation mix, roads occupy a significant share of that transportation mix, today around 60%. And we don't expect, given the size of the country, we don't expect major changes there. We see, yes, the government also with a railway investment agenda, but as we also know, investment in railway will require significant investments, and given the public deficit and the constraints on the government side to invest and allocate public funds to those railway projects, we do see roads to continue to dominate the transportation mix in Brazil. The size of the opportunity is very significant. Brazil has 1.7 million kilometers of a road network. Most of that is owned, controlled, managed by the state and municipal governments. Only 7% is under the federal jurisdiction on a national level. But the fact is, of those 1.7 million, only 12% are paved road network, and therefore there's significant investments in terms of paving, not only paving that network, but also duplicating and widening some of those roads. And this is an important point, because when we talk about roads in Brazil, most of these investments, if not all, it's about paving and it's about widening existing roads. The concept of greenfield, it's something that is not usual. And it's not usual because already we have that network. It's not in good quality, but requires that widening and pavement to go to the standards that the transportation sector requires. If we go to the next slide, private sector participation has always been key in Brazil. And so we've seen year by year an increase on the number of roads and kilometers under private sector management. I think probably different from other countries, there's a view that private sector participation is key, not only in roads, but also on the water sector, as Eduardo mentioned. And I think the reason for that is actually when we compare the quality of the roads when they are managed by the public sector and by the private sector, we can see these differences. And there's an institution, Confederação Nacional de Transporte, Transport National Confederation, that does this study every year on the quality of the roads in Brazil, and it's very clear that private sector managed roads have always shown better results than public managed assets, and this has to do again with the allocation of funds to the public sector for them to be able to manage those projects on their own. And given the constraints I've mentioned in terms of allocation of more funds to public sector organizations, we see clearly a need for more and more private sector investment, particularly on those roads where user fees will be sufficient to pay for that investment. And that's also a trend that we see in Brazil. Clearly, the way that pipelines are defined, the way that projects are prioritized, they will favor projects mostly where the user fees are sufficient to pay for the investment. Again, for the same reasons related with constraints on the public deficit, we don't see many projects coming to market where there is any sort of subsidies, contributions by the government for that road to be sustainable. So the priority will be the roads where the traffic is sufficient to pay for that investment. The role of the concessionaires has therefore been critical in terms of meeting the infrastructure gap in this sector. Nevertheless, as you see on that graph, investments by private sector concessionaires has been decreasing in these last years. Part of that, yes, has to do with the real devaluation against the dollars, but most of that was we've lived since probably 2014, 2015 until recently a changing environment in Brazil. Until 2014, projects were coming to market, and the construction companies were dominating those markets. They were the contractors of those assets, but also the long-term operators of those. And of course, with Lava Jato, there was a change in the way that government was also is starting to approach this sector. So clearly, we see government now much more keen to attract long-term investors as a way to replace a role that was once taken by the domestic players, and particularly by the construction companies. And this change, I think it affected the pipeline, because there was no confidence of having all of those players available to bid for this project, and clearly the government understands that they need to have more players bidding for this. If I was to give an average on the last tenders, we would see on average two, three bidders for each roads, for each of the roads being tendered, which is a reflection of the fact that we see a changing face of the infrastructure players, particularly on this road sector. The government is therefore also revising some of the regulations affecting this sector, the way that projects are tendered. Before, there was a focus very much on the tariff. So again, as this is a user fee funded road, tariff was the criteria before to award a tender. The player that would offer a lower tariff would win that road. In the past, it showed that the results were not fantastic on this, and we've seen very aggressive bids with very low tariffs that then with lower traffic than the one that was initially forecasted, and particularly because of the crisis that emerged in 2014-15 with Lava Jato. We've seen some of the concessions not being able to deliver the investment plan, and this has led to a change in regulations to have some of those contracts terminated and now being retendered. So when we see pipeline, we see, yes, many of the deals, new deals. Again, they need to pave all of these roads. They need to duplicate all of these roads that are still in public management. But also you will start to see deals that were recently awarded, contracts are being terminated, and they are being put again into the market with a different criteria that is not only based on the tariff, but it's also based potentially, and this depends of course on the deal and on the economics of the deal, on the upfront fee that the private sector bidder will offer. So significant changes in the market. You would also see, in addition to these deals, some of the initial concessions that are now coming to an end being now retendered. So we have, for example, Nova Dutra, one of the first concessions to the private sector that is now coming to an end, and next year we'll have the tender for that road, where the private sector will bid, yes, for an existing road that has an history in terms of traffic, but also the government is putting additional investments and expansion of that road on that package, making that one of the most sizable deals coming to market soon. If we go to the next slide, please. Again, don't forget, as I've mentioned, state and municipal are the main owners of these roads. So not surprisingly, we see more roads being led by the state and in some cases fewer by municipal authorities, and we have less on the federal government. But it's very clear that São Paulo has always led the way in terms of the number of concessions coming to market. A very successful, very experienced state, and that has also been driving changes in terms of regulations to attract more infrastructure, long-term players. And so not surprisingly, you'll see those 20 or more roads, 21 concessions with a total of 7,700 kilometers owned and managed by the São Paulo state. And then you have a number of other states also with some concessions awarded. And this has been steadily growing. But one thing that is very clear is when we have all of those 1.7 million kilometers I've mentioned, when we have only 12% paved, when we have still a lot of concessions and a public management and not offering the quality that the sector needs, there's much more investment that needs to be done, and that's why the government has elected roads as a major priority for 2021-2023, where we have a pipeline of significant deals coming to market. If we move to the next slide, we will see the size of the opportunity. We're talking about only in 2021 and 2022, 24 road concession projects coming to market. Of those, we have 13 federal projects and 11 state projects. The pipeline is much more than this, and for 2023 onwards, we will have more deals coming to market. At that stage, more with state projects and municipal projects. I think the federal government is very keen to move the agenda forward, and that's why, despite we having much more state and municipal roads, it's the federal projects that are coming to market first, as they are driven by this willingness of the government to move and to lead the way in terms of infrastructure investments. We're talking about 19,000 kilometers of roads being tendered, and with an investment for those 24 roads over $30 billion. It's a very significant investment across the country, and with these different profiles I've mentioned, profiles that have again concessions that are now expiring, are now being returned for the government, and they are retendering that. Concessions that have been tendered recently, but because of the crisis in 2014, 2016, some of these assets are now being returned to the government. And then you have projects where the focus is paving some of those existing roads and duplicating some of those existing roads. But again, these are not typically the green field, as I've mentioned. These are much more the brown field or the yellow field, as some would also characterize them. Again, we see the momentum is now, and many of you may ask the question, but why it's now different? But the momentum, we see it now, and we see it now because in terms of the pipeline is very significant. Most of these projects are now under the approval of the National Courts Office, or the TCU, as it is called in Brazil. And so they are on final stages. Some of them are already prepared, but because of COVID this year, it was difficult to come to market with these projects. And also financing-wise, these have changed significantly, right? In 2016, we had a base interest rate of 14% that has now decreased significantly. 10% has decreased between 2016 and 2020. So even in terms of financing, it's more facilitated. Yes, still very dependent on the public sector banks, as Eduardo just mentioned, but we see a trend now with lower interest rates. We see a trend for more private sector financing to these projects. And the opportunity is now not just because of the pipeline, but also, again, as I've mentioned, in terms of competition on these projects, there aren't many players, because of the reasons I've mentioned, there aren't many players bidding for these projects, and with 24 road concessions in the next 2, I think this makes one of the sectors where we can say that the opportunities are very relevant. Also because of the track record, I think it's a difference for the road sector, the fact that there's an history of more than 20 years of regulations in this sector, of learning, of the regulators becoming more solid, becoming more independent. And I think this makes also the road sector very attractive. We do have on the next 2 slides a list of the projects. We will make these available to you. There's links to more information for each of those assets. But you see there the size of the deals, the size of capex, the extension of these deals, which reflects again the continental size of Brazil. Conscious of time, I will stop here, and we'll have the questions back in the end. Back to you, Marco.
We'll move now to the tax insights regarding infrastructure opportunities in Brazil. And we know that tax is always a very relevant aspect of any planning, especially regarding Brazil. And we'll give a general landscape, talk about the main taxes here in Brazil, and also discuss the most common investment structures, and then touch a little bit on the potential tax reform here in Brazil. Moving on to the landscape, as I mentioned, Brazil is a complex tax system with over 70 different taxes. Differently from most European and countries in the US, we do not have a consolidation system, so each entity is viewed as its own taxpayer here in Brazil. The statute of limitation here is of 5 years. There are several different tax incentives and tax benefits that are very relevant for the infrastructure area here in the country, and Marco will touch a little bit on this later on. Tax disputes are very common and usually take a long time to resolve. They might come either from the taxpayer trying to derive a little doubt or difficulties that they may have with the tax authorities, or they may come from tax assessments, which are also very common and may lead to high penalties going from 20% for a late payment or 150% in case of a fraud or sham. Brazil does not follow the OECD guidelines. Brazil does have transfer pricing rules, but they do not follow the OECD standards. Brazil also has transfer pricing and tin cap rules. We also have CFC rules. We tax foreign profits once a year. And two last things that are very relevant on the landscape: succession risk or corporate reorganization. So in light of a spin-off or a merger, the surviving entity will carry on the tax exposures from the previous entity. And the Brazilian labor law has a history of being more favorable to employees than employers. Next slide, please. Here, just a general overview. We have 3 main categories of taxes: federal taxes, state taxes, and municipal taxes. On the federal taxes, we have corporate taxes, IRPJ, and CSLL, combined rate of 34%. And we have the famous PIS and COFINS. There are 2 different calculation systems for PIS and COFINS: the cumulative regime, which does not allow the taxpayer to calculate credits, and the non-cumulative regime, which has a higher rate of 9.25, but allows the taxpayer to calculate credits over previous transactions. Moving on to state taxes, the most relevant and famous one is ICMS. The rate varies from one state to the other, and also according to the service being provided. ICMS is very relevant when we're talking about infrastructure, not necessarily the areas that we're discussing here today, roads and water, but for energy and telecom, for example. And finally, municipal taxes, the most relevant one is ISS, which is our tax on services. Rates vary from 2 to 5% depending on type of services and also on the municipality. And now Marco will guide us through the most common investment structures.
Hi, everyone. Hope you are safe and well. Thank you very much, Camila. I think it's very important that we are aware then that when we are talking about Brazil, we are facing a totally different tax environment. And it's also true when it comes to the relationship between the Brazilian tax authorities and the taxpayers. Brazilian tax authorities has changed the way they are looking to the transactions and also to the structures. They are taking now much more substance over form approach. And then when they look at this, it's very important that all the structures that I'm going to talk about have business purpose and economic substance. This, I would say, it's key in order that the taxpayer is not challenged by the tax authorities claiming that the structure were only set up with the purpose to reduce or avoid the tax. So one of the very common investment structures in Brazil consists in incorporating a holding company in Brazil that will be the buyer of the target company. This structure is set up with the purpose to enjoy the tax goodwill amortization. Okay, and the goodwill amount will be basically the purchase price minus the net equity value of the company minus the net asset fair value. Okay? And this, the goodwill now is it's the same amount that is recognized for accounting purpose, while in the past there was a difference because for tax purpose it was the amount paid minus the book value of the company. For this structure work out, it's very important that again we have business substance, economic business purpose and economic substance, and this should be carried out between unrelated parties. The goodwill amortization trigger event will be the merger between the holding company and the target company. Okay, this can be upstream and downstream merger, and will have different consequences. Though, so it's very important that you analyze which one would work better for you. The goodwill amount will be amortized for tax purpose in a minimum period of 5 years. Okay, and this should also, of course, be reflected in your modeling. The next structure, it's private equity funds. Okay, this structure basically will provide a tax-free investment in Brazil. But it's very important that the taxpayers will fulfill some of the requirements. Okay, I will say that the three most important ones are that the foreign investors are not located in a low tax jurisdiction. One single investor or in conjunction with its related party does not hold more than 40% of the total quotas of the fee or has the right to receive 40% or more of the total income and proceeds paid by the fee. The other requirement is that the fee should hold in its portfolio at any time that securities exceeding 5% of its net equity. Okay, so important point here is that when we talk that one investor should not hold more than 40%, this should be also analyzed in terms of the ultimate beneficial owner. Okay, and although the tax authority has issued an interpretation that they will only look to the first tier, we always advise that this should be respected until the ultimate beneficial one. Okay, and this structure does not eliminate the previous one. As we show here in the slide, the fee can constitute the holding company that will then acquire the target company. The next slides, the next one that I will talk about relates to the funding alternatives and repatriation mechanism. One of the most common ones will be invest through equity. Okay, when you're going to send the money to Brazil, basically there will be IOF of 0.38%. So it's important that you take the gross up to really have the net amount here in Brazil. And the repatriation alternatives regarding to equity will be dividends that in Brazil is basically tax-free, or interest on net equity. Interest on net equity, for those that are not familiar, I would say would be a kind of deductible dividends, okay? But it's treated in Brazil as an interest, and therefore there would be 50% withholding tax or 25% withholding tax in case of a tax haven. This interest would be deductible in Brazil, okay, 34%, but I call the attention that for those investors that are located in a country that follow OECD guidelines, these will most likely be treated as a hybrid instrument and then will be taxed in the home country. So it's important that you run the math to see if it's worthwhile to get the deduction, 34 deduction in Brazil with some limits, but it will be taxed in the recipient country. The other alternative to invest in Brazil would be through debit. Okay, debit in Brazil, as Camila already mentioned, we have a unique transfer pricing and thin cap rules. This should be observed here. The interest will be deducted in Brazil, and there will be a 15% withholding tax or 25% in case of tax haven. Okay, here I would say that the ideal scenario would be that we could have this debt pushed down to the target company. That would be operational one, so they can enjoy the deduction. Or otherwise, this will in the end become a tax loss at the level of the holding company. Of course, there is the risk because the tax authorities can claim that this debit was contracted with the purpose to acquire the company and does not relate to the operation of the company. So we also point out that this risk. The next slides show a very typical infrastructure project. As you can see here, and we have touched base basically on the upside of this slide where we were talking about the investment structure and also funding and repatriation alternatives. But this is just a part of the whole project. This shows a typical infrastructure project where we have much more players, right? Basically, it's very common that we're going to have ISP that will be the concession holder, and also maybe it will be the leader of a consortium, okay? And we will interact with other suppliers. In Brazil, as Camila mentioned, we have no consolidation purpose, no consolidation. So each of these players will be a different taxpayer and will be subject to different tax and also different income tax regimes. In the next slide, I show you here some examples. Okay, so here, as you can see, different players here are single taxpayers and they are subject to different tax burden. So it's very important that you reflect this in your modeling, okay, and think very carefully about the supply chain, because even some of those taxes are not recoverable. And in the end of the day, it will become a tax cost. So think about this structure, I would say, is essential. I hope I'm not scaring too much, everyone, but also we have good news because we have a lot of tax incentives. Basically, tax incentives in Brazil, we can say that it's based on location or on the sector, okay? And for infrastructure, we have a lot of tax incentives for this sector. The most common one is REIGE, that is a special incentive regime for infrastructure development. This special incentive basically will eliminate all the federal transaction taxes in the supply chain, which will, of course, reduce the tax burden and also impact the cash flow of the project. But we have other very common ones as Repetro, that is widely used in the oil and gas industry. Okay. So I would say that the takeaway here from a tax perspective is that tax should be very carefully analyzed from the structure, from the supply chain, and how will be the interaction between the different players that are different taxpayers. Because if you don't do this study, basically you can be out of the game. So with that, I will hand over to Camila so she can tell us what's next.
Thank you, Marco. What's next? So the big talk of the town here in Brazil is the potential tax reform. We don't have much clarity on what's coming forward. We do know that we have different proposals for tax reform that come from congressmen, the society, and the government. And to focus here today, we chose to go with the government proposal, which is intended to be split into 4 steps. The first step would be the conversion of physical fees into CBS. So these 2 contributions would be consolidated into a single contribution with one calculation method, so no more of the cumulative and non-cumulative regime. And the 2 contributions would also have the same rate. So instead of the 365 and the 925 that we have today, all taxpayers would be subject to the 12% rate. This is the only bill that has been actually presented so far, and due to different aspects, not only the COVID-19 crisis, but the fact that we had municipal elections this year, this project has not moved along in the congressional houses. Step 2, yet to be presented, would be a reform of our excise tax, the IPI. The change would be in the rates and the levels of selectivity of this tax. Step 3, and this is a very relevant and anticipated aspect, would be the change in the corporate income taxes rate, which would be expected to drop from the current 34 to something around 20%, and also the dividend distribution taxation. So currently in Brazil, dividends are exempt, and the tax reform would implement some sort of withholding income tax on dividends here in Brazil. Step 4 would be a payroll reform to reduce the total burden on payroll here in Brazil, and this would be subsidized by the creation of a new financial or digital tax that we still don't know what's yet to come. This is just a general proposal from the government. We still do not have a lot of clarity on the timing and wording on how the steps will be proposed to Congress and what other changes Congress will implement to this step. But this has been on the news every day, and there's a lot of anticipation on how this steps will actually come to life here in Brazil. We're still expecting the final bill regarding steps 2, 3, and 4, and we understand that has been a delay this year due to everything that 2020 brought upon, including the COVID-19 crisis and also the election. Thank you, Marco, and I think I revert back to Danielle.
That's right. Thanks, Camila. So I guess we get right into Q&A because we have about 10 minutes left. We have received one question here, and the question is, in your view, what will be the annual investment and demand growth rate in roads for the next 10 years? So I think, Fernando, that probably goes over to you, correct?
It is, yes. Thank you, Danielle.
Perfect.
Again, I think when we look at roads, there's a gap in the very short term that amounts to $30 billion. But we don't expect this to be fulfilled and met in the next 2 or 3 years, because between tenders, between all of the process to award a concession, start of the construction, and having then the project in operation, it takes time, and so I think the overall expectation is that those 30 billion will not be realized before a period of 5 years, counting on all of those construction work. Of course, the challenge is not on the supply side, in the sense that I think the pipeline is there. I think what will be critical for the government is to attract investors, because although the projects start to be ready and we have a number of projects in the pipeline, I imagine one of the critical aspects of the government will be to manage that competition, right? Because they want to make sure that with competition they will get value for money. So that's why I think even the 5 years you'll get some delay, just because it will not be effective for the government to put all of those roads at once in the market, because there will not be sufficient players to bid for that, to generate that value for money, and then to drive these projects forward until the quality of services is on the levels that the government expects.
Okay, thanks, Fernando. Just a reminder, if anybody else has questions, feel free to type them into the question box on the right-hand side, and we'll field them and pass them through. I guess maybe myself, while we wait, I have one bit of a curveball for the panel, if I could. Having heard that there are a lot of opportunities in the infrastructure space, and we listed all of them on one of the slide decks here. What is the panel's view in terms of them moving ahead? I mean, I was on another infrastructure panel a few weeks ago, and we saw just after that Brookfield made the large investment in the water and sanitation concessions in, I think it was Alagoas State, if I'm not mistaken. So That's a very positive sign in my view. What's the panel's view in terms of moving ahead with some of the projects we listed here?
I got you.
Answer this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Daniel. I can answer this. Very good point raised, Daniel. I think that what we saw last September and last October in terms of the water and sanitation, the results of the auctions were outstanding. In September, as you said, on the Brookfield one, there was we're talking about an investment of 3 billion reais. Once again, divide by 5 to get the numbers in US dollars, but this number repeats on October. Other concessions that have investment capex of 3 billion reais were in the market. We talk about Brookfield in terms of Canadian backing up the investment of the Brazilian company on sanitation, but the other ones on October, we're talking about sovereign wealth funds backing up the private companies. Okay, the concession that's going to be paid for the government reached a goodwill of 13,000%, which I believe reinforces how they understand the amount of opportunity.
Well, it seems maybe we lost Eduardo here. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Maybe we'll move on. We have a similar question, and maybe someone else on the panel can ask it. We have somebody asking, has there been engagement with other actors to push towards more water and sewage projects by increasing demand through judicial orders / class actions? I would guess that means in terms of compliance with the original agreements that they may have entered into. Maybe someone can take one of that question.
Yeah, I can take, Danielle. That's also a very good question. So the water sector has also been dominated by public sector management. So you have a number of state companies managing these water projects, and the fact is, again, it was a market where private sector participation was limited, and those contracts have been done many years ago. I've actually seen for the first time in my life recently a contract that was handwritten. So imagine how old that contract was. The fact is those contracts did not foresee what for today for us is the vast practice in terms of clearly having objectives in terms of quality of service and levels of service across a population in a certain municipality or state. And so what is happening, there's an ongoing work whereby the national regulator for water, ANA, is looking at a way for those contracts that have been not so clear in terms of investment targets and quality of service, for some of those contracts to be terminated and to be already re-tendered again, now in an environment with more sophisticated contracts that follow best practices. So we see a number of initiatives of the government following the approval of the regulatory sector framework last year and also this year, an effort by the government to do that. So first, asking those companies, state-owned companies, to show that they have capacity to deliver the contracts they have. This is critical. Where that capacity does not exist or there is no prospects of that service to be delivered, those contracts should be therefore terminated and then put again in the market, already having the private sector competing for that. And then that's another principle of the regulatory framework, is to have to open that market to private sector institutions. So we see that happening. I would say 2021 is still a year of transition, because those state companies need to show that they are financially strong to deliver. There will be discussions about what contracts are to be terminated, what contracts will will still survive. But then I would say from 2022 onwards, you'll see a number of deals coming to market that already reflect that contract termination and the re-tendering to the private sector.
Okay. We have about a minute left. We have 2 questions in the queue, so I'm going to try and combine them into one question for the sake of time. And it's sort of from an international investor perspective. The question was, having in mind the required governance and financial reporting levels, and I'm going to bucket it just as overall ESG concerns at the moment, from international pension funds and private equity, are there any matters that an investor should be concerned with in the sector? And how are these typically approached? There was a follow-up question just in terms of FX and foreign exchange restrictions related to foreign capital arriving from abroad. So I'm not sure, maybe Stephen, you can take it from an international perspective, or Eduardo, I'll pass it back to the panel.
Eduardo, why don't you have the first crack at it?
Okay, in terms of the governance, what I can say, and we have been talking to some PEs in Brazil and of course with the government, is that if you look at the new law, there has been created a National Water Agency. It's going to be, of course, a new one with new people. There's an historic of good relations with the Telecommunications Agency and the Energy Agency. So what we see from the government and what we see from some PEs that we have been discussing is that there's going to be a need of a specific, how can I say, function of someone in those companies that will have to liaise very closely to this, to the municipality level or to the government level and with the agency. Because we are talking about opportunities that some of them are from the municipal area. We have a country as big as Brazil, so different municipalities and different governments, different way of performing your questions and addressing your issues with them in terms of rebalancing the contracts, so on and so forth. So I believe that they expect this, and the companies should be prepared with this as well. Okay.
And then I think, Dan, just going to the core question of, is the government serious? Foreign exchange is one of the ways where people can really see whether the government is serious or not. And my sense is that this is a case where Brazil has decided it has to do this.
Yeah.
It's the sector, but it's also the credibility of the country that's on the line. And my sense is those are 2 very positive things from an investor perspective to look at as you're considering whether or not this is a place you want to invest. My sense is that Brazil has made a decision. Not only does it want foreign capital, it needs foreign capital. And these are both good examples of places which spell to me a very positive outlook for the 2 sectors and for the government. Back to you.
Perfect. Okay, just a reminder as we close out here that we will make the slides available to all the participants, and if there are any other questions, feel free to reach out with the contact list in the slides. So Fernando, I think I'd pass back to you to close out the event.
Yes, and thank you, Daniel, and very quickly as we've gone through minutes over the hour, but just to say that we truly believe that this is the momentum to look at Brazil. I think there's a number of factors that opens the opportunity for international investment, particularly from long-term investors into these sectors. We live in a moment where, yes, regulation is still evolving, but also we have a strong view that if we are aiming to have that perfect regulation in 5 years, 3 years' time, the competition there will also be completely different. So I think that what government has shown that is they are keen to attract international investments. They are committed to create the conditions for that investment, and that's why I think it's the time now to look at particularly these 2 sectors where the investment required is very significant. I hope that was clear for you in this presentation. I hope we were also clear the challenges, but also the step-by-step that you can go through on the tax side, which is a critical element on your investment into Brazil. And from a KPMG perspective, we're very committed to Latin America. We're very committed to Brazil. We do think that these investments will make a difference and will improve the livelihoods of Latin Americans and Brazilians. And therefore, anything related with infrastructure, please reach out. We will be very keen to support you. Thank you all. Thank you for participating. Stay safe and have an happy Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.